girls. Good afternoon. I love Greg's advertisement for his own group was for someone else's group, you know. I love that. Where to go and what to say this morning. I've got so many thoughts. As always, you guys know that. I do want to point out that I have a twin again today. This keeps on happening to me. But he promised me that he wasn't going to come up this time and interrupt what I have to say. So I told him I don't really believe him, but you know. Okay, we're going to, there's just a few things I want to share that I've been germinating on and thinking about that I think are pertinent, hope would be pertinent, and then we're going to end in communion. I had a conversation with a friend of mine just the other day, maybe a week or so ago. He had shared a dream with me, and the dream had the ship, the Titanic, in it. You guys know what that is, right? So it's interesting. That's one of those things that just kind of has entered into the public consciousness. The story is over 100 years old now. It's 1912, I think, is when it happened. But it's still something that lingers within our memory, not even because there was a really famous movie about it, but even before that. And so the conversation I had with him about his dream and regarding leadership and the season that we're in as a church is what the dream was about. Made me start looking at the Titanic and just refreshing my memory about the story, and I felt like the Lord was showing me some stuff about it. And so I want to share some about that in the context of where we are as a church, as a body, broader than SCC, but pertinent to us as well. But before I do that, I want to remind you about a conversation I had with you guys right around the beginning of that disastrous time called COVID. I was talking about a prophetic word I felt like the Lord had spoken to me in 2018. And some of you will remember this, some of you won't. So some of you weren't around at that point. So I just want to refresh some of you and then for the rest of you give you some context. Because I think it's pertinent to what I'm going to share. In 2018, I was sleeping early morning, and I kind of was jogged out of sleep by the voice of the Lord, very clearly, inner voice, not outer voice. Those things happen and they can be very terrifying, the outer voice thing. But a very strong, the voice of the Lord resonated within, and he said to me, what's coming to the church will require a Romans 11:4 response. And, it was so distinct that it kind of snapped me out of sleep. And I like sleep. And so I had to fumble around. My phone was nearby to fumble around because I didn't know offhand what Romans 11:4 said. It's one of those things now I can't forget it. But it snapped me out of sleep, and I pick up my phone, I look at Romans 11:4, and I go, and it just sent me on this journey. I actually ended up writing a bunch of blog posts. I wrote a book about it. We put videos out about it, and I think it's very pertinent still today. What's coming to the church will require a Romans 11:4 response, and Romans 11:4 says essentially this, depending on your translation. It says, "And what was the divine response?" And then it quotes back to 2 Kings, I believe. But it says, "And what was the divine response?" And the quote is the Father speaking, and he says, "I've reserved 7,000 who have not bowed their knee to Baal." What was the divine response? "I've reserved 7,000 who have not bowed their knee to Baal." Actually, if you look at the original quote, it also says, "or kissed him with their mouth." I've reserved 7,000 who have not bowed their knee to Baal or kissed them with their mouths. And it's speaking of the prophets. It's God speaking to Elijah about the after the 400 prophets of Baal, the fires come down, it's consumed the sacrifice. Elijah goes, woe is me, Jezebel wants to kill him, Ahab's not happy with him, and Elijah says, I'm the only one that's left, and the father says to him, it's all right, Elijah, I've reserved 7,000, they haven't bowed their knee to Baal either. You're not alone in this. So that's the context of the quote. When I read that, I felt like the Lord began showing me, as I studied and wrote and thought and prayed and dialogued with the Lord about it, that there were three principles inherent to the Romans 11:4 passage that are pertinent to us today. And it's summed up in what was the divine response? I've reserved 7,000. That's the second principle. And the third principle is who haven't bowed their knee to Baal, nor kissed him with their mouth. So it's incredibly pertinent today that we understand the divine response. What is God like? What's he saying to us? How is he leading us? How do I respond to him, and how does he respond to me? So that's almost a difficult thing to understand. That's something we're led into. What is God? How is he leading me, and how is he coming to me? What's his response? Well, that's always kind of the age-old question. How do I hear his voice? How am I moved by him? The second is, I've set aside 7,000, and the question is, have you been set aside? Not set aside as in ignored, but he's reserved them for himself. Tracy said this, that our goal in our heart is to always abide in him. He's the one that does that. He sets you aside. He draws you in. He hid these ones for himself. Have you been set aside from the pursuit of worldly things, worldly pleasures, all this kind of stuff? Have you been set aside, abiding in him? And the third part of it, who have not bowed their knee to Baal. That sent me on a whole trajectory of studying Baal worship in the Old Testament. And there's all kinds of outworkings of that, and they really, when you start boiling them down, you can really see parallels with the political spirit today, nationalism, and what people have started calling revivalism. Revival is great, but sometimes people look for the revival to fix their problems, as opposed to just following Jesus in the everyday. We want revival, but we get into revivalism, and so everything has to be the next great revival, just a normal meeting. And you can see those things happening within the context of Baal worship in the Old Testament. And so we see these things still pertinent today. I think we do anyway. This need to know the Father's response to us, what's he saying and how he's leading us. This need to see myself as being set apart, hidden in a cave, just waiting on him every single day. And this need to understand that the worldly systems are working to influence me, and I can't bow my knee to them. I bow my knee to him. And I can't honor them with my lips and kiss them with my lips and become intimate with them because I'm intimate with him. So, breakneck speed now, warp speed 9. Hosea 2. You guys tracking with me here? Hosea 2. Verse 14, I think, helps us to understand, because God addresses specifically the Baal worship in the nation of Israel in Hosea 2. And starting at 13 actually says this, I will punish her for the days of the Baals, where she used to offer sacrifices to them, and adorn herself with her earrings and jewelry, and follow her lovers so that she forgot me, declares the Lord. I'm getting somewhere with the Titanic thing, by the way, okay? Just don't forget that part. We're going to return to that briefly. That's going to sum everything up. So Israel had so welcomed the worship of Baal. Israel here, and think about this. Israel so welcomed the worship of Baal that God's going, I have to punish her because she's offering sacrifices to a false god. The nation of Israel. But that's kind of crazy if you think about it. But it's not so crazy when you think about the church being caught up in the political spirit and hyper-nationalism. It's no longer about the kingdom of God. Like, think about this, okay? Think about this. The conversation about what God wants to do often revolves around making the nation great again. Whether it's Canada, whether it's the US, whether it's Australia, whether it's New Zealand, whether it's European nations, God wants to make the nation great again. So the nation capitalizes the church and the kingdom. That's fascinating. The conversation isn't about making like God's going to save the nation. Well, God's going to save the people and build his church and his kingdom. That's the kingdom perspective, not God's going to build the nation. God reserves himself. Hebrews talks about us being foreigners in the land. And we think ourselves as citizens in the land trying to build up the national identity. So nationalism has become a distinct problem in the Christian church. Because God's calling us to be a people set apart, not Canadians that participate in church, but Christians that happen to live in a country that embody the kingdom everywhere they go. So our conversation has to change. And I can see shades of that in how Israel got caught up in the way other nations worshiped. I can see shades of that today. So what does God say he's going to do? It says in verse 14, behold, I will allure her. He's going to woo his nation to himself. He's going to woo his church to himself. I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness. Amen. I'll bring her into a difficult time. I'll bring her into a place where things are dry. And it says, I will speak to her kindly there. I'm going to remind her of the first love. You know, one of the things that I was watching one of the live streams, not the recorded one, but when the team was in California at the Jesus conference, there was a session where a bunch of nuns spoke. And one of the nuns was asked a question by the Lord. And the question that she was asked, I can't remember exactly the whole story, but this is basically the for you Canadians, it's the Coles Notes. I'm American, so it's the Cliff Notes. You're with me, okay. And the question was posed to her, how do you hold a wounded God? The Father asked her that. How do you hold a wounded God? Because when we see God, we see the picture of him on the cross, wounded for all of creation. And the picture of it's so tender. How do you hold your first love? It's almost a foreign concept to us. I was thinking about this, like when after Savannah was born, our first, Erin got really sick, and she had to go back to the hospital. Right? And she was in the hospital for she had 104-degree fever. They were concerned about sepsis. She was on heavy antibiotics. She was passing out left, right, and center. It was terrifying as a husband. Right? And my whole world oriented around her safety and protecting her and holding her. Right? It was like I had to hold my wounded wife, my wounded bride. And it's all that I cared about. Preserving that, making sure she got the right treatment. And I was thinking about that, like returning to the first love. If I'm holding her, nothing else is important. I feel like everything, there's a lot of things that are important, and we're like, well, I guess I'll spend 5 minutes holding him. You know, Sunday is a great reminder of our affection for the Father. But would that we didn't need a reminder because we were always in affection for him. I will allure her, I'll speak kindly to her because he has to remind us of his tenderness. You know, I said a few weeks ago that I have to constantly remind myself, like almost daily, don't be an orphan, Josh. Don't be an orphan, Josh. The Father is kind and he's tender and he's drawing me. Don't be an orphan. It says this, then I will give her her vineyards from there, and the valley of Achor is a door of hope. The word for Achor means trouble. I will give her the valley of trouble. Some of your translations will say that. I will give her the valley of trouble as a door of hope. We try and escape from trouble. He leads us through trouble and teaches us I'll give her her vineyards there, her sustenance. I'll speak kindly to her there, and she'll find a door in the midst of it. Not run away from it, but I'll walk her through it. And she will sing there. It's interesting. She doesn't go through the door to get out of it. She learns to sing in the midst of it. I will sing there. as in the days when she came up from the land of Egypt. And it will come about in that day, declares the Lord, that she will no longer call me, I'm looking at the NASB, so it says this, she will no longer call me Ishi, and she will call me Ishi and no longer call me Baal. The word Ishi means my husband. She will now call me my husband, she will no longer call me my Baal. So the thing is, Israel was called, this is the crazy thing about this, right? Hosea 2, I will punish her for the days of the Baal where she used to offer sacrifices to them. And then he says, she won't call me Baal anymore, she'll call me my husband. So they were thinking they're worshiping God, but in fact worshiping Baal. They were calling God Baal. So I'll remove Baal's name from their mouth, so they'll no longer worship me as if they were worshiping Baal. They'll no longer conflate the worship of Baal with the worship for me. They'll no longer conflate the mission of the church with Christian nationalism. They'll no longer conflate the worship in the church with hyper-revivalism. They'll no longer conflate the worship of church with the political spirit. Now they will call me my husband, and it'll be about intimacy with me. So he promises to bring us into a place where we're reminded of his tenderness and love and affection in order to remove from us the ways that we conflate and misappropriate or misunderstand what he's like. Because we've been so enculturated by the worldly systems. Does that make sense to you? You guys are tracking with me? Okay. I'm landing this, all right? Titanic. As I was reading about this, spurred on by the dream my friend had where he heard an angel say to him, don't sink it like the Titanic. And he knew it had to do with the things that he's leading. And I'm listening to it and I'm praying through it and I'm going, this is a word for the church. This isn't just a word for my friend. And he serves as a prophetic leader as well. And what I discovered about the Titanic was, everybody knows the old statement that they made that it's unsinkable, right? So right off the bat, everybody knows that one. Right off the bat, it's unsinkable, right? There's and it was a modern marvel of human accomplishment, right? It's unsinkable because look how great we've built it, right? You think about the modern day parable of that. Whether it's church, organization, my life, it's unsinkable. I've got great relationships. It's unsinkable. My marriage is great. It's unsinkable. My church is great. It's unsinkable because I've put so much effort into it, right? Because I've done it, right? Your marriage is great because the Lord built something. Your church is great because the Lord established something. Your organization is great because the Lord established something, not because you did it. Listen, David learned that lesson a very difficult way. I established you, David. You didn't establish you. I did. Right? So the first thing is the arrogance placed in human accomplishment. We did it. The second thing is, on the day that the Titanic crashed into the iceberg, you guys know the story, obviously. It's not, Leonardo DiCaprio wasn't actually on Titanic, by the way, okay? I saw that movie in the theaters because I heard that there was a massive boat crash, an incident. I think men and women saw that for different reasons, that movie. Yeah. It was pretty cool when the ship went down. So, the day that Titanic ran into the iceberg, the crew had been given no less than 10 warnings about icebergs and ice fields in the area. And they ignored all of them. And in fact, the radio station where they were radioed the messages didn't have a system of conveying to the leadership from the people in the radio station to the leadership the problems on the ground. Actually, they say probably only 4 of the warnings got through to the actual captain of the ship. And the captain ignored all 4 of them. But there was no consistent system between what the people were hearing and what the leadership was seeing to be able to convey the message that they were getting to there. So there's a disconnect between the leaders and the people. The people are struggling with this. The leaders aren't seeing it, aren't hearing it, aren't feeling it. Also, the prevailing wisdom of the day was that time was of the essence, and so all the ships through that channel would run at 100% of their speed. So they never slowed down because they thought it's just an ice field. That channel had been gone through multiple. Actually, the captain of the ship had just successfully navigated one of the other ships through there not that far before that. So it wasn't like it was an uncharted place. So they thought an iceberg can't harm the ship, and so we can go at full speed through this whole thing. Rather than listening to the warnings and slowing down, they were at 100% of speed. Because prevailing wisdom of the day said, it's not a problem, you need to make up time, so go your full speed. Most of the boats did it. And the third thing was, when the warning came, because they had lookouts, it happened in the middle of the night, they had lookouts. When the warning came from the lookouts, the captain could already see the iceberg. So there was no time to pause and redirect. They tried to veer out of the way, but it was too late. They couldn't slow down, it was too late. They tried to veer out of the way, but they couldn't. 2.5 hours later, the whole thing had sunk and, tons of people died because of it. But as I'm thinking about that and looking about that and thinking about Romans 11:4 and the need to know the divine response, the need to see ourselves as set apart, the need to be separate from the systems of the world, that we haven't touched Baal, we haven't bowed down to Baal and said, this is the kind of people we are. It's like I'm thinking about this Titanic thing going, they had a culture of the day that said, we have to move a particular speed. The culture of the day said it's okay. They had no idea how to pause and move from rest. No idea how to slow down. Because the culture around them said you're supposed to speed up. They had a culture of the day that said, we're unsinkable. Everything, nothing's going to go wrong. We don't have to deal with these problems. These things are minor. They're just inconveniences, the ice field. The culture of the day taught them you're supposed to respond to these situations this way, and it led them into all kinds of trouble. Well, this is how we do it. So the three things that I think are applicable to us in the story of the Titanic is pride will shipwreck us, our inability to slow down will wreck us, and our unwillingness to pivot will destroy us. How do we stop? So moving from a place of rest doesn't mean to be inactive. That's not what it means. Moving from a place of rest means I'm not agitated. So I can see and sense what the Father's doing. And I'm not pushed into movement, but I'm with Him and I'm moving in His footsteps. Right? I don't plan for 5 years in the future in that sense, because my whole goal is to step in His footstep as He steps and vacates the one in front of me. Pride will wreck us. Our inability to slow down will be disastrous for us. And our unwillingness to change direction and pivot when things get difficult or when we recognize the signs, it'll be disastrous for us. To God, I think, and Heather, you can come up, because we're gonna end with a time of communion, turning our hearts to the Father. So the Father is leading His bride, the bride He's preparing through a season. And it's really easy to just say, well, this is the way we've done things always. It's really easy to say, well, we put so much effort into this. We've built it. Well, there's nothing that could happen. Nothing that could go terribly wrong. It's really easy to look at the signs and just go, we're going to ignore it all. Right? He's alluring us into the wilderness. He's speaking to us tenderly there. He's using the season as a means to purge his bride so that the ways we've related to him are totally transformed. And if we get in that same mentality that we see culturally in the Titanic, we rush right through that season and nothing changes for us. And we come out on the other side with the exact same problems we had on the side before we went in there. Well, it's interesting that I was thinking about this morning as I was preparing. It's interesting that we've had in the last 5 or 6 years so much upheaval in the world, not just in the church, I just mean in the world, so much upheaval. And I'm not sure that we're willing to pause and reflect, even at this point, and go, in what ways are we just kind of coasting through life? We make all kinds of assumptions, like Christianity. It's Aaron and I do, and I know here we at the church do the healing conference coming up. Aaron and I do prayer counseling with people. Lots of people do that, and it's like one of the things that we can do is we can think that Christianity is all about getting healthy, and that's a good thing. But that's the byproduct. We can get so caught up in what the end goal is that we miss the point of welcoming the King in our midst. That the goal, like, do you know that what's on the heart of God throughout Scripture is to take care of the poor and the needy? Like you realize that what's on the heart of God is not always just your personal well-being, but he goes, there's the poor and the needy in your community. Right? And sometimes we go, well, okay, we need to get everybody healed. And that's good, right? I'm not saying it's bad. But we miss the forest for the trees sometimes because we've got a culture. This is how we do things. This is what we're supposed to do. Our aim, what we look to, is not necessarily always the kingdom coming in its midst. And I'm not just talking about SCC. I'm talking about the church in general. And I think the Lord's challenging us in this season. He's alluring us into the wilderness, and he's causing us to look at ourselves. He's going, what's the kingdom all about in your midst? What are you all about? I know it's easy to, on a morning like this morning, you get a bunch of wonderful people leading life groups up to just hear it and then kind of go about your day and forget about it, rather than engaging with people in the community. Like that's one of the first places that transformation in community happens, is participating in a group like that. But we don't see the gravitas of the moment. Like I would constantly need to be reminded that this is about him. And it's not about escaping the trouble, but learning his kingdom in our midst, radically transforming the world, taking care of the things that are on his heart. Don't hear me say, I'm not saying your personal well-being is on his heart. Aaron and I do that stuff all the time. People in the church here do that stuff all the time. It's a really good thing. It's only one part of the puzzle. And we can miss the bigger picture of his kingdom coming. Right? Communion. Communion is all about, like when you look at it historically, communion is participating in the life of Christ in your inner man. You're communing with him. Some people have said it's a sign. Some people have said it's the actual presence of God. I don't care what it is as long as it impacts you. Right? However you approach it. That his life is being lived in here. And it doesn't bow, seems such a trivial thing to bread a little bit of juice. But this is saying, my inner life doesn't bow to the systems out there. I'm not part of that world. I'm distinct and separate, and he's set me apart. And I'm not going to worship the systems the way other people do. So as we take communion this morning, what I want to be on your mind is that as you partake, You're making a declaration in your inner man that you're different. That everything's different. That you're not a citizen of Canada or America or the Philippines. But you're a citizen of heaven. And that means your life is radically different than anybody else's. That you're committing to walking life out in absolute humility. That you're going, I'm going to slow down and tune in with the Father. That I'm going to be willing to change when I see the need for change, or address the thing when I see the need to address it. Or find the one, the person on the side of the road that needs help, or the one that needs a lunch or whatever. I'm going to see them because I've slowed down. Because I'm not too arrogant to say, well, I'm busy. I've got too much to do. Unless I think we're in a season where where the Lord's calling us back to that. So why don't you all stand? And what we're going to do this morning for communion is, and I know we've got to close up here, but Heather's just going to play some music and lead wherever she feels led. It's the day after her birthday, so she's very spiritual. But communion is between you and him, this declaration. I'm going to walk in humility, I'm going to pause, and I'm going to move only as you're moved. It's a declaration of that this morning. And so I just invite you to come of your own accord. Take communion as you're led to communion. You can all line up and get it, but it's just I'm not going to say another prayer or anything like that. I'm just going to say, you come and take it. And get before the Lord with that thought. I'm humbling myself today. I need your presence. I got to slow down to be with you, only be moved by you. Just come with that thought. That as you take communion, that's the life within you. And Jesus was never hurried. Communion is about his life, and he's never hurried. He was exactly on time with everything he did. Even when people thought he was late, he was on time. He was never hurried. He was never agitated. Never felt forced to do anything. Just as the Father led, he did. As the Father wooed, he came. Let him woo you this morning and this week. So come.